Frugal Innovation Forum is a platform that encourages leaders and practitioners to come together, discuss, debate, and learn from each other. And here's our journey so far.
Thousands of innovations are blossoming in the global south every day. But not all of them always reach those who need it the most. It's often hard to find the right approaches, collaborators, financing models, and more importantly, an ecosystem. Since 2013, Frugal Innovation Forum has brought together leading practitioners from development, corporate, technology, and entrepreneurial sectors to engage on how to create lasting change with limited resources.
Innovation means a lot of different things to different people, and at BRAC we have a very specific understanding of what it means. It's simple solutions, solving problems, and scaling up, and thinking about that from the beginning. BRAC wanted to create a space where we could talk about this type of innovation, and so we thought Bangladesh was the best place to have this conversation because, again, it's grounded in the context, and so many impossible things have already happened here. Since 2013, we've been holding the Frugal Innovation Forum. We've been really excited to see some of the solutions that emerged from this, the new types of co-creation, the partnerships, and the inspiration that all of us get from this type of conversation.
We figured in 2013 that we need a platform where practitioners can come together and talk about various innovations that's working in the ground. And that's where the genesis of Frugal Innovation Forum in 2013 that started. And we have been doing it for 5 years, where funders, practitioners, policymakers come together and talk about solutions that work.
Join the conversation, pitch your innovation, collaborate with like minds. To know more, visit innovation.brac.net.
Such an endeavor is glorified today with the presence of education experts, enthusiasts, researchers, practitioners, and leaders sitting in this room. Distinguished guests from home and abroad, a warm welcome to you all to the 5th Frugal Innovation Forum organized by BRAC. This year, we will focus our discussion on scaling quality education. It is a great honor and pleasure for us to have the Honorable Minister, Advocate Mostafizur Rahman, MP, Ministry of Primary and Mass Education, People's Republic of Bangladesh, with us. With that, we are going to start our day with the welcome remarks by Mr. Asif Saleh, Senior Director, BRAC and BRAC International. I'd like to request Mr. Asif to come up on stage and welcome our honorable guests. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Hope you had a great start yesterday, Honorable Minister. I want to start today by giving some context to why we are here today. There's a crisis in education in the world, mainly from 3 aspects. If you look at access, while significant progress have been made in some countries in terms of access, latest data from UNESCO shows that almost 263 million children and youth are out of school. An astounding figure that is equivalent to a quarter of the population of Europe. The total includes 61 million children of primary school age, 60 million lower secondary age, and 142 million upper secondary school age children. Even in positive cases where countries claim to have 100% access records, the class sizes are abysmally large to have any meaningful learning impact at the school. There are simply not enough government infrastructure to keeping up with the demand of the market. Education in most of the developing world remains quite shocking. Half of the children in South Asia and a third of those in Africa who complete 4 years of schooling cannot read properly. In India, for example, 60% of 6 to 14-year-olds cannot read at the level of a child who has finished 2 years of schooling. In a survey of rural Indian schools, a quarter of teachers were absent. In Africa, World Bank found teacher absenteeism rates of 15 to 25%. Pakistan recently discovered that it had over 8,000 non-existent state schools. 17% of the total population. Sierra Leone spotted 6,000 ghost teachers, nearly a fifth of the number in the state payroll. A rigorous 4-year study of 6,000 pupils in Andhra Pradesh in southern India suggested that private students actually performed better in English and Hindi than public school pupils, and at a similar level in maths and in Telugu at the local language. The private schools achieved these results at a third of the cost of the public schools. Similar examples are in Nigeria as well. What does it mean for parents? Government schools are free, but at the same time, parents have to pay in a lot of cases for uniform, for books, for shoes. Not in Bangladesh though. Bangladesh books are free. But in a lot of other countries, they pay for lunch and PTA fees, exam fees. Now, when you accurately catalog all these costs to send a child to a government school and all these costs to send a child to a private school, you get a very interesting result as well. Again, I give you some research from West Africa, from the slums of Monrovia in Liberia. The research showed that the cost to a parent of sending a child to a government school was on average 75% of the cost of sending a child to one of these low-cost private schools. Yes, private schools are more expensive, but it's not cripplingly so. And compared to the erroneous idea that the government schools are free and private schools are expensive. If you add the cost of the private tutors, the private school, public schools actually become more expensive as well. Within this context, also in terms of, we have decided to hold this year's Frugal Innovation Forum to look at the simple solutions that addresses the big riddle of quality. This is a yearly event hosted by BRAC's Social Innovation Lab. BRAC, for those of you who don't know, is a not-for-profit organization that started as a relief organization in 1972 after the Liberation War of Bangladesh, and within 45 years have evolved into one of the largest development organizations that runs about 9 large-scale programs ranging from education, health, financial inclusion, agriculture, and it has 13 social enterprises, 7 different investments for long-term sustainability. Having said that, education remains BRAC's one of the core key flagship intervention and something very close to our founder's heart. That's why the one-room school model intervention that started back in 1985 now has evolved into many different forms of primary schools, early childhood development centers, pre-primary schools, secondary schools, a university, a dedicated institute in the university on education, which is solely focused on building capacity of the public system. We will get to hear about BRAC more in the opening session and the closing session as well. But yesterday, some of you at various field visits went to see some government schools and also some other schools run by BRAC. You looked at some of the replicable models and asked some very tough questions in the evening as well. Today, we will get to explore some of those. Today, we will hear about some of the shifting trends in education globally. We will hear about assessments and some of the second generation of tech adopters in education. We will hear a debate on whether education is at all linked to employability these days. We will have a workshop on early childhood development and different quality imperatives. We will also bring in 4 private school operators to hear more from them about the shifting trends, and last but not the least, some great models in public-private partnerships that are happening. Tomorrow, we will get to hear about different financing models, the ever-growing need of education, of displaced population, the refugees, and governance of various school systems, and the growing debate of higher education versus vocational training. In both the days, however, we have given priorities and focus to innovators so that they can talk about the brilliant work that they're doing. And also, our theme this year is scaling quality education. So we hope between these innovators and some of the other partners, funders, investors, policymakers who are here, some great partnerships will come out of this conference so that some of these great innovations can be scaled up. There's a picture I actually wanted to show. Is there a picture? Yes, this is going. This is a picture that I have in my office. to constantly remind me to the value every family, no matter how poor they are, has started to give to education. This is a picture from a slum in Dhaka. Education they look at as an investment to break out of the cycle of poverty. Are we able to keep our promise to this mother? We are thrilled to have all of you today to explore this question. We have participants and speakers here from 5 different continents, representing a wide array of policymakers, practitioners, and investors and funders. We are most excited today that our Honorable Minister for Primary and Mass Education, Advocate Mostafizur Rahman MP, has kindly agreed to inaugurate the conference today. Let us give us a round of applause and welcome our Honorable Minister.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, let me first convey my thanks to BRAC and its Frugal Innovation Forum for inviting me to this celebrated event on innovation, which aims to boost quality education not only in Bangladesh but also in South Asia and beyond. Today's event reassures me that those days are not very far when our dream of turning ours into a knowledge-based society will be a reality. The past decade has seen rapid progress towards universal primary education. In 2000, globally, 102 million children of primary school age were out of school. By 2011, the figure had fallen to 57 million. However, the world still needs a first and stronger focus on the marginalized children to get them in schools. Bangladesh's education system is large, catering to over 36 million students. We have made spectacular success in improving access to education, particularly through our pursuit of MDG targets. In 2016, the net enrollment rate in primary education reached 97.96%, while the net enrollment rate for secondary education reached 67.84%. The target of ensuring gender parity has also been achieved in both primary and secondary education, well in advance of 2015 MDG. The decrease in the rate of primary school dropouts is also noteworthy, from 47.2% in 2005 to 20.4% in 2015. The number of students appeared in the secondary school certificate examinations is gradually increasing. Bangladesh, along with the whole world, is now driving forward to fulfill its Sustainable Development Goal targets for education to be met by 2030. To systematically pursue these targets, Bangladesh government has adopted a phase-by-phase approach, beginning with its 7th five-year plan for 2016 to 2020 period. To pursue our SDG targets for education, we have two strong policy guidelines, namely the National Education Policy 2010 and the National Skill Development Policy 2011. We are aware that the first 5 years are crucial for Bangladesh's SDG journey, and so we have set critical targets for this period in the 7th five-year plan. Below is a summary of our targets in this period. Achieve 100% net enrollment rate for primary and secondary education. Ensure 1 year pre-primary education for all children entering primary schools. Increase female enrollment in technical and vocational education to 40%. Enable the working youth and the older workforce to acquire required skills, raise the ratio of literate female to male for age group 20 to 24 to 100%, raise female to male in ratio in tertiary education to 100%, increase literacy rate to 100%, equip all primary schools with at least one and all secondary schools with at least 3 multimedia classrooms, equip 30% of primary schools and 100% of all secondary schools with an ICT laboratory. Through ensuring these facilities, we would aim to create an enabling environment for learners to enrich themselves in knowledge and skills essential to thrive in the 21st century. Our successes have come through a strong collaboration between the government and its development partners, as our common goal has been to invest in the generation of leaders. BRAC is our renowned education partner, while there are other non-governmental partners too. Together we will pursue and achieve our SDG targets. Bangladesh is fast emerging as one of the world's most potential economies. But to realize that potential, we have to deal with a number of challenges that include ensuring high quality education for our children. We firmly believe that with all our collaborative efforts, we will beat those challenges to make our dream of creating a self-sufficient, empathic, industrious and knowledgeable society in Bangladesh. Thank you all. Joy Bangla, Joy Bangabandhu.
Thank you, Honorable Minister, for your very thoughtful speech. It surely will guide us to think differently to achieve more success in ensuring the quality education through innovation. I believe you all are very excited by now and ready to learn from each other as much as possible. Before moving to the opening plenary, I'd like to mention some of the logistics and ground rules. We have an amazing group of colleagues who are working as part of the organizing team, wearing ID cards with green ribbons. I'd like to ask all my colleagues, the organizing team, to stand up so that everyone can see you. So they're there. If you need any kind of help, please feel free to reach them. There will be session managers in every session. The speakers and the participants, if you need any kind of help, they will be there. We will have breakout sessions. So for the parallel sessions, some will take place here in the auditorium and some will be in the other room there in the other building, in the banquet hall. So they will also be showing you paths to there. To run the session smoothly, we will be expecting the phones to be on silence, and I'll also request all of you to be precise while asking questions so that your fellow colleagues get a chance to ask more. Please use the hashtag #ScaleFrugal and tweet as much as you want. And I hope you have received you were welcomed at the registration desk with the eco-friendly conference bag, which is packed with pen drive with resource documents from education and research, power bank, a tumbler, and a folder with booklet, notepad, pen. About 30 participants went to field visit yesterday who have visited BRAC pre-primary school, primary school, government school, and private schools. Thanks to all of them, and who were not there, you can of course catch up during the breaks and listen to their experiences. And thank you all with this. I hope you will enjoy your session. You will enjoy the day very much. And I think we are on time. Not on time. Actually, we have we have finished our session even 30 minutes earlier. So with that, I'd like to request to start the plenary, which is shifting sands in global education across the world. And I'd like to request our moderator, Mr. Asif Saleh, to come up on stage with the speakers, Dr. Safiqul Islam, Yan Attfield, and Fatima Dada.
Senior Education Advisor from DFID, and of course Fatima Dada from Managing Director Pearson, English and Schools, Pearson. Please. We have also Fatima Dada, who's the Global Managing Director of English and Schools in Pearson. She works on product strategy, innovation, and development across the globe in English, language assessments, and school sectors. She's also the chairman of Africa Ignite, a not-for-profit working with rural communities, and a trustee of MIET, an NGO working with vulnerable children in Africa. Fatima has been on several ministerial committees and overseeing education reform and policy development in several countries, including working for UNESCO to support education systems in Mozambique, Malawi, and Zambia. And she is a council member on the Schools and Vocational Quality Assurance. Currently, she's actually helping to lead the transformation to sustainability of the education unit of BRAC in Bangladesh. So we will hear a little bit about that story as well from Fatima. And on my further left, we have Yen Attfield, Senior Education Advisor and DFID, Education Policy Team, focusing on non-state education, teaching, and learning. Yen has worked as an advisor in Nigeria, Zimbabwe, and Tanzania, developing and overseeing education programs and evaluation. He has worked extensively on a wide range of diverse education instruments. His interests include EdTech, open data applications, education management, inclusion, learning matrix, evaluation, sector analysis, system reform, GIS, school mapping, microplanning. And he has blogged extensively on his work. So thank you everyone for being here. I will actually start with Yen. I mean, the format here is that I'll ask all of them a couple of questions in the beginning, and that's about 10 minutes per speaker. And then the last 20 minutes of the panel, we will get to hear from them, and you can ask questions yourself. So since we have a bit of extra time, we may have a half an hour. So starting with Yen, we are talking about shifting trends in the global education sector. I would like to hear from you, if you can, to talk about a little bit about financing from a donor's perspective, how you're seeing some of these changes that are evolving in this.
Well, I'd first like to really just to thank BRAC and to really for hosting this great event. It's really great to be here. It's my first time opportunity I've had to come to Bangladesh, and it was really delightful yesterday to see some of those amazing BRAC schools that we visited. We've heard so much about them for a long time, so it's really great to see them in reality. I'm going to try briefly to give a sort of donor perspective, at least, on this event, because to some extent, without donors, without governments, without the sort of funds to scale, innovation can end up, without having the impact that we all desire. I've put up on the top of this slide the idea that we're on a journey, and is it really a journey from access to quality? And to some extent, have we come off the rail tracks? Because I think some of this talk about global learning crisis really has some quite negative connotations that we have. I think a standard interpretation from the year 2000 Education for All goals and the MDGs has been that there really has been a huge surge in mostly public enrollment. But clearly with that have come struggles of systems to cope. Rapid expansion, population growth, failure to adapt or reform, issues of obviously of economy, politics and conflict. But there have been major successes. There is predominantly gender balance in education. Universal enrollment rates in primary are certainly above 90%. But I think that it's not a new thing that quality and learning is important. I think certainly within DFID in the UK, we've seen these signals well before 2010, and the idea that a global learning crisis is emerging. On the chart behind me, you'll see some really quite stark figures for sub-Saharan Africa. At the bottom, almost perhaps disguised by some of my panelists' heads, as these little green bars. Those are children who are both A, in school, and B, learning at the suggested level. Sorry, I didn't mean to suggest that. And you see that they're really quite small. The dark blue are the children who are in school but not learning sufficiently. The light blue are the out of school. So it's great that we've got that light blue bar diminished in size, but that big chunk, especially in primary, roughly 6 to 11-year-olds, is really striking. On the left, we're measuring children in the hundreds of millions. I repeat that, hundreds of millions. But what's particularly frightening when we look into the future, the red bars are the extra children that will be around and seeking quality education by the year 2050. That's within 1 or 2 generations. And so to some extent, we need to get that green bar to come all the way to the top. This is based on some of the latest data that's come out from UIS. So while I don't think we should be beating ourselves too much about expanding education, quality is really important. I did some work in Vietnam some time ago, and I was sort of tasked to come up with, a measure of quality. There it was called a Fundamental School Quality Index. We dreamed up, I think, 36 composite index factors, which had all sorts of inputs. Did you have concrete classrooms, trained teachers, books, all sorts of factors. And that was really helpful to drive equitable resource allocation to some of the poorest parts of Vietnam. But in the end, I would say that quality really does boil down to learning outcomes, and in particular the foundational skills of maths and literacy. Although increasingly all those 21st century skills that we really value and are really needed for the new economy are important. Higher income countries have had these large-scale comparative assessments in place for several years. But many lower income countries typically haven't had a good way to measure representative learning. And I think that's one of the frontiers at the moment, is to make sure that both at the micro, school and local and the national level, we really understand what children are learning. So moving on a bit in terms of investing in quality, there are, what potentially has or can go wrong? What are signals of weakness? Well, clearly not having data, not even knowing how many children there are in a country, where do they live, who are out of school, how old are they, are their births registered, are children stunting? All of these things really limit anybody's ability to tackle problems if you don't know the size and extent and location of your problems. The chart above me by the Nobel Laureate Prize winner Professor Heckman is, I think, really important. The earlier you invest, the bigger the returns on your investment. And I know that's really deeply embedded into BRAC and many people's work, and that's really important. Early years education really matters. Other signs of weakness in some contexts has been very much the growth of low-cost private schools. Now, that's to say that's a bad thing, but clearly in some places, in particular in peri-urban growth, it's really a sign that public sector system can't keep up. And that's really why this phenomenon of low-cost private schools has scaled so much. Another country that I've worked a lot in Tanzania, is a classic example of some of those weaknesses. It tripled, I repeat, it tripled its secondary enrollment in 6 years in the last decade. But then things started to sort of really fall apart as it just couldn't open up, it couldn't provide teachers, it couldn't provide the resources, infrastructure. And ultimately, enrollment stagnated because children were just dropping out because there wasn't a great deal of purpose to be in school. I think that for the Global South, there are really unique lessons to learn. That recognition of the income and equity gaps that still exist across the globe, but those problems still remain to tackle. It's stunting, not obesity, which is a challenge for a lot of the higher income world. Demography, so many African countries, the population still doubles every 25 to 30 years. And I think it's a topic that will be touched later, in terms of where do the jobs come from? Are these salaried, regular jobs in manufacturing and factories, or is it self-employment and agricultural type work? What are the skills needed for those roles? I'd like to sort of introduce the concept of the first generation learner, because I think if we're to scale education for those children in the red and the blue on the earlier graph that we saw, they're really children who are coming in from the remoter communities, whose parents are often illiterate or haven't had the benefits of education. They're often maybe in school, but they may not be learning. There's issues of huge grade 1 classes, that they don't speak the language of instruction, the nourishment isn't adequate. Fee structures or the opportunity costs are opaque or difficult. There are often undiagnosed disabilities or specific needs that children have. To some extent, we have to scale and innovate school systems to adapt for those children, rather than assuming that our current models are correct. A really influential report that came out last year has been led by the UN Special Envoy for Education and former Prime Minister of the UK, Gordon Brown. His commission is known as the Education Commission, and they put out a really seminal report, The Learning Generation, which is really trying to sort of support the SDGs through to 2030. They came up with these, a set of recommendations in these four key buckets, which we'll briefly touch upon: performance, innovation, inclusion, and finance. And I think the thesis is that you need elements of all four of these. While we're focusing on innovation on the top right in this forum, the fact is that you need all four to make things happen. With all the innovation and passion and inclusion in the world, you won't be able to scale unless you think about systems and have the right incentives and performance and finance to make those a reality. A huge spender of any education system, public or private, is teachers and teacher payroll. But I think, as you mentioned earlier, attendance rates or effective time on task in classroom can be well under 50% in many of the countries studied through the World Bank Service Delivery Indicator surveys in a number of African countries. That measures loss in terms of GDP as 1 to 2%. It can be measured in billions of dollars, and that is a huge place. Certainly, performance incentives are really important to get things to work. On innovation, I won't say too much because I know that many people much better suited will focus on that in this panel and later in this seminar. I would like to highlight the report of the Brookings Institute, led by Dr. Rebecca Winthrop, the Can We Leapfrog? I think we all know about leapfrogging, for example, where mobile technology has leapfrogged landlines, phones, for examples. But I think that they've critiqued, 3,000 education innovations. So there's a real sort of theology and learning going on around education innovations. But a couple of key points: only 2 to 3% of those innovations could actually provide cost-effectiveness data. If you can't quantify what something's cost, by definition, you're going to really struggle to scale it. Also, what are you innovating about? What is the problem? Do you have technology looking for a problem, or do you start from the problem? Areas which have far fewer innovations that are needed in terms of where you look across these thousands of potential innovations are areas, for example, on education in conflict. What's happening on the border with the influx of Rohingya refugees? What's happening in South Sudan, in Syria, and many of the crises all around the world? That's where innovation is needed. We needed innovations for children with disabilities, who are often the most marginalized. We need a lot more innovation in Africa, where the earlier chart shows where there's been this huge shortage of resources, teachers, and a booming population. So I would say that those are some of the areas we may want to focus more on around innovation. Innovation and the role of the non-state and public-private partnerships. I know, as I said, there'll be a lot of focus on those areas. DFID really are interested in the promise of public-private partnerships. It was great to have you, Asif, and others around at the event we hosted in London back in September. And I would say that we remain really interested in this space. And I think just hearing about the Shistu Nikoton schools and seeing how that journey will progress towards a cost sustainability model is one of those vital things to scale. Moving on to the second bucket, inclusion. The concept of progressive universalization, I think, is a really key one. We may have universalized widely primary education, but that isn't the case, in particular in Africa, for early years, for pre-primary education. And the idea that you have to tackle those inequities and disadvantage young, and that, according to the Heckman curves, gives you the biggest bang for your buck, the best rate of returns. And so innovation for early years education, I think, is one of the key factors. On a blog that I put up, which is on the forum's website, really looks at a great example in Tanzania from the EQUIP program that ran a 16 weeks school readiness course in lieu of a major 1 to 2 year pre-primary program. It was found to be have equal school readiness impact, but at a fraction of the cost, around only 20 US cents per day per child. moving finally to finance, which is I think where you really wanted me to give a bit more detail. Investing sufficient resources, I think, is the key commitment for everybody. Donor finance and financial grant aid, I think, is probably declining in importance as we move further into the 21st century. From a DFID's perspective, we spend, I think, over £12 billion a year on our UK aid budget. But to some extent, we know that we have to justify these resources to our taxpayers. And I think most other country donors are in similar positions. Globally, I think that there is a fairly tight market. It's a bit of a zero-sum game for new grant resources. That's not necessarily the case, I think, for some of the multilateral development banks, as I'll come to in a moment. There's currently a lot of macro finance going on to try to really develop new and innovative macro financing instruments that can really make more money available. For example, there's a lot of impact investment finance going on. The UK's Development Finance Institute, CDC, we're currently injecting several £billion more of investment capital there for impact investment. There's attempts to generate new impact bonds and leverage approaches where donor money is multiplied by investments from the private sector or from sovereign debt and those sort of more exotic treasury instruments. The Education Commission is trying to work up the International Flexible Financing Facility for Education at the moment, which may come hot on the tails of the Global Partnership for Education replenishment event that will be held next year. I know that Bangladesh, currently benefits from the GPE, but that really is a really major new instrument that's grown over the last decade to provide grant resources to low-income countries. So on the topic of donor finance in particular, as I said, I think it's declining in overall relative, in particular, to domestic resources. We do a lot of work, I think all donors do, about trying to improve tax revenues and tax base to make sure that there's more money and there's better use of those resources. And so to some extent, results finance has to sort of try to lever the resources available in a smarter way to increase value for money. And I think the World Bank's done a lot of work to try to sort of really think about how we can jointly incentivize actors around a set of systematic results. Education, both public and private, is part of a large system, and this is complicated. The sort of diagram you see on the right here, seems to say, well, if you can actually align all those actors, it's not just about the Ministry of Finance in a country, it's the Ministry of Education, how you get those virtuous loops with results, with finance going down, right down to the local level, data flowing back. And you have to align those political economy incentives to make all this work. I mean, there's some dissent, a triple challenge about how we get universal access with demographic growth, how we make our schools better, and how we respond to the fiscal pressures that inevitably emerge. Certainly a lot more of these concessional loans from the World Bank and the multilaterals will very much be linked to results finance in coming years. And that often involves defining disbursement-linked indicators which can help to lever changes if you can align effectively. And I think these are some of the areas that happens in the donor to government dialogue in Bangladesh with PEDUP 3, PEDUP 4, and the new secondary education loans. Certainly, it's not easy to get this sort of approach to work well. DFID has is experimenting a lot with payment by results instruments. We've tried results-based aid in a number of African countries, such as Ethiopia and Rwanda. I would say that they've been partially successful, but it is really hard. For example, I think in Ethiopia and Rwanda, we'd define success as paying for extra school completers, for teachers who could pass competency tests. But it's quite difficult to prove that those additional resources, equate to additional children learning, and to really link the money, because often there's that pressure from our domestic home base to show that this extra money is to some extent buying these results. The real world often is a lot more complicated than that. We've now got a number of major research programs, like the RISE program, which is trying to really figure out in much more detail how education systems work, how finance can be used more effectively to gain learning outcomes. Also on the FIF blog, you'll see that the case that I worked on a lot in Tanzania of President Kikwete's Big Results Now. And there we link payments directly to improvements in early grade reading, oral reading fluency, and with quite a positive, successful outcome. I'd like to finish with one example which I think combines so many themes that we're talking about in this forum. And that's, I think, an example that might appeal certainly to Sorrow in the audience from South Sudan. And this is the Girls Education South Sudan program. This is a really great example that combines finance, conflict, acute needs, and also technology. There's been a long-running civil war in the world's newest country, South Sudan. But even in the midst of that crisis, the Girls Education South Sudan program has really set up this innovative technology-based program that feeds back near real-time data from all of the schools in the country, and using mobile money provides stipends to over 200,000 girls so they can stay in school. You can see two girls over on the right of the photo, Biki and Esther. They're using those stipends to fund some of the key elements they need to continue schooling, to get solar lights to study by, shoes, exercise books. There's nothing sort of, complex around the pedagogy or teachers in this particular innovation. But what it does do is keeps people in school, leveraging mobile data, leveraging mobile money transfers. At the same time, it enables the Minister of Education to track, in the midst of a civil war, which schools are actually open. You end up with a heat map like the one on the left with the red and green dots showing which schools are open off terrain that's often completely impassable due to the climate and due to conflict. And that's a really, great innovation. They're building on that innovation. Now teacher salaries can't be paid through the regular banking system. So now teacher stipends through another donor are coming in to really keep the schools open. So overall, I'm really here to learn with you all. I'm really looking forward to engaging with you, to continue engaging with you at this forum, and learn what I should take back to DFID about how we can do more of this and better scale quality education. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yen. That was very comprehensive. I'll take one piece of information from one of your slides, which is talked about the triple pressure on access, fiscal pressure, and better school. And whether it's the state or the non-state actors, they're all facing very, very similar pressure. So would like to welcome Fatima to talk a little bit about from the perspective of the non-state actors. Pearson, of course, has been a player for a long time in different areas in education across the world. What are the changes that you're seeing? Please, thank you.
So I'm standing here because I really admire Ian. He was able to manage his notes and a mic and the slide transition, so amazing. He's touched on some themes that I will touch on from a slightly different angle as well. I'm just waiting for the kind of slides to get into transition mode. Am I doing something wrong? Okay. All right, so while we're waiting for that, just to say it's really wonderful to be here. Good morning, brothers and sisters, as they say in Bangladesh, a country which has really endeared itself to me and really, really humbled me over the last 2 years as I've worked closely with Safiq and Asif and several of Safiq's team members who are here today. It's really been amazing. It's really important to get the balance between working in the kind of developed north and the developing south. I come from South Africa, a developing country, but I do a lot of work in the US, UK, Italy, etc. And it's important to get the perspective, which is why I do a lot of voluntary work as well. Okay, I think we're getting there. So today I want to touch on 3 areas really. Just by way of a taster, because this is meant to be more of a discussion than a long talk. So the first thing I'll talk about is touch on some research Pearson has recently conducted into the future of skills and education and work. I'll then move on, and I was very pleased to see Ian introduce the topic, is the concept or the notion of leapfrogging by the Brookings Institute. So I'll talk about that because While I agree with the idea of leapfrogging, and I think it has huge, huge advantages, I live in South Africa where the banking system literally leapfrogged within an 18-month period and became a world beater. However, I do believe in the idea of incrementalism and setting the scene. We need conditions for success. Ian mentioned the very low success margin of some of the technological innovations, and we need to be very mindful of that, particularly with the limited resources and the frugality we'd like to introduce into the work that we're doing. And therefore, as such, I will close by really very briefly touching a little bit on the work that Safiq and I did together in BRAC education program over the last 1.5 to 2 years. So to start off with, I'll quote Charlie Leadbeater in a book that Pearson published called The Problem Solvers. He says, in a more volatile, uncertain world, increasingly driven by innovation and entrepreneurship, we now also need to equip young people to find and solve problems of all shapes and sizes. They especially need to be prepared to tackle problems that do not come with instructions. Young people face a world that is more exponential, more fragile, connected, and unpredictable. To serve them well, education needs a new sense of its purpose and a new paradigm for how it's delivered. So when we talk about quality education, at its base, we are talking about providing learners with the content and knowledge they need, but in combination with the skills and tools they will need to use this knowledge and function as responsible citizens. At Pearson, we recently produced a research study in partnership with Nesta, an innovation foundation, and the Oxford Martin School. It is titled Future Skills, Employment in 2030. It's an exciting piece of work, and I urge you to access and read it. It's available to all on the internet. And I have managed to read several hundred pages of it. Why it's exciting is that many studies on employment look largely at the predicted impact of automation, and we have studies that go back many decades in this area. But this one tries to look at it across multiple global trends, including technological change, globalization, demographics, environmental sustainability, urbanization, increasing inequality, and political uncertainty. So it's quite a complex piece of work, but is presented in a really accessible way. Some of the main conclusions, and they should be no surprise to you, and I'll touch on 2 in particular, is that although it will always be necessarily imprecise to predict future jobs, we can, however, know quite a lot about the skills that will be valuable, and therefore how best to prepare our young people. Knowledge, when found in combination with softer skills, and I see in the conference handout as well, there's a piece there on the 21st century skills, but knowledge when found in combination with softer skills will be key. And we all know the importance of STEM knowledge, coupled now with systems thinking, decision making, and problem solving. So Charlie Leadbeater himself came to very similar conclusions in another of our publications, as I mentioned, The Problem Solvers. And these 2 pieces both point to the importance of skills to help us prepare for what is an uncertain future. Now onto the notion of leapfrogging. So Ian mentioned the Brookings Institute, which raised skills inequality and skills uncertainty as 2 major global education challenges which need to be addressed. Brookings predict that at the current pace of change, skills inequality is not going to be solved anytime soon. In fact, they found that it would take approximately a century for girls and boys in poor countries to catch up to today's education levels in rich countries at the pace at which we are currently moving. This is a very scary thought for me. They therefore suggest leapfrogging as a way forward to help bridge this gap. Defined as, the leapfrogging they define as any practices, whether new or old, that enable skills inequality to be much more quickly addressed than the current 100-year gap predicts, and any practices that enable us to meet the challenges of skills uncertainty in a rapidly changing world. The framework displayed here suggests what the leaps might look like toward a different, more individualized model of skills development, for example. As you can see on the right-hand side of the continuum, employers become increasingly involved, and post-secondary institutions increasingly value and understand the changes that are needed to the credentialing system. But can we leapfrog? Is it possible to simultaneously address both skills and inequality and skills uncertainty? So the concept of leapfrogging through innovation is admirable, and as I mentioned earlier, and as we know from banking systems and from technology, is achievable as well. But I believe that with education, leapfrogging needs to be supported by incremental gains. You need to get to a baseline before you can make the next big advance, particularly technologically. And it really warmed my heart to hear all the detail that Ian was going through. If I had another topic, that's exactly what I would have said. Those themes about access and quality are really, really important. And in the context of the Global South, what is considered big might seem small elsewhere. And this is another humbling thought that when we think of innovation, we need to be very mindful of. So with that, I'll touch then, as I promised, very briefly on some of the work Safiq and I have been initiating in BRAC. So BRAC's education programs have been looking at how to come up with a more sustainable model to enable them to continue with those models or those projects that have a very high social impact, some of which it would be a very scary thought if they had to be discontinued, as Safiq keeps reminding us. So working with the BRAC team, we decided that it was really important to establish a holistic approach to evaluation of their work within a more comprehensive framework. So we established that we develop a quality framework first and foremost, within which we could effectively evaluate all of their programs, and which we did, working in partnership with them, including pedagogy, operations, and finance. It's really difficult when one thinks of innovation, particularly frugal innovation, without thinking of the more practical sides of life, and which business has taught me to do with the financials and the operations. So we spent a lot of time looking at that. Further, we agreed to develop recommendations using a two-pronged strategy to enable continuation of the current trajectory of work through all the different programs that they have in schooling, from ECD right through to secondary schools, and also, as I mentioned, some of their very targeted social impact programs. To ensure fidelity to BRAC and BRAC education programs' vision and purpose, which have always been and remain and will always be very noble, we started with their own vision and worked from where they currently are, ending in recommendations, thereby offering a complete and holistic evaluation and alignment for their sustainability needs. So we developed a set of, we developed an entire holistic school framework for effectiveness, and within those we have indicators and we have lots of details there. So we have 5 key indicators and we have 22 performance indicators which flow from these 5 indicators. And the idea then is to use these to evaluate the impact and effectiveness of all their programs. There's a lot more detail underpinning this. I know Safiq would like to have it written up, which we will help him do, and there isn't time today to go into the details. But just to end with what is, I think, one of Dr. Musa's favorite slides. We developed a method, an XY axis tool, to be able to plot the sustainability and the social impact of all their programs. So this was a kind of culmination of the work we did over more or less a year, going through all their programs. And we developed a set of indicators and measurement tools to measure social impact versus financial sustainability. And the programs, I guess if we had asked Safiq to make an educated guess on where he thought they would fall, he would probably have come to the same conclusions. But it was really good to have gone through something of a more considered and scientific approach to arrive at that. And so we arrived at the top right-hand quadrant with the programs that we think are relatively more easily financially sustainable. And then on the top left quadrant, the programs that have really high social impact that Bangladesh can't afford to discontinue or not fund. And so we're looking at how we raise external funding for those, but also over time, how the programs on the right-hand side could potentially cross-fund on the left-hand side. So I think I want to end by just saying it's really important to keep one's feet on the ground. This is where the rubber hits the road. This is where the students are. This is where you have the positive social impact and where you change people's lives. And while one may come up with all sorts of research projects and theories, as I've discussed or mentioned in the earlier part of what I've said, we've got to be able to ground them in the reality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fatima. That was great, and sets up very nicely with Shafiq Bhai's talk. I think Shafiq Bhai, we heard from some of the participants last night that one of the reasons we are here is we also want to hear the BRAC's education story, how it evolved over time. I know it's a long story, but maybe you can highlight a little bit on, from the early days, how some of these interesting transition point occurred, and starting with the latest transition that is happening. What was the context of setting up the first BRAC school, and how different times thinking evolved over time, and why? So if you can, in the larger context, kind of how you see BRAC's role going ahead in the coming days. Thank you.
Very good morning to everybody. How many minutes I get, Asif bhai? 10? Okay. Because the BRAC story is not a simple story. And Asif bhai also asked that the post story has to be related to this whole discussion that Ian and Fatima started. As most of us in this house, we are aware of, when BRAC started its journey in 1972, one of the core programs that BRAC had was the adult literacy, based on the philosophy of Paulo Freire, which was meant to empower the people through literacy and education. And BRAC did it quite successfully for more than 10, 15 years, till middle of 80s. One of the field visit of our founder, chairperson, Sarah Abed, to the northern part of the country turned around the history. One of the mothers standing while chatting to him and asked that our children do not go to school. And those even who go drop out earlier. So they have to wait that they would be eligible for BRAC at adult literacy courses. Because to be eligible for adult literacy courses, one has to be illiterate and one has to be an adult. So that was the striking remark that Mr. Abed brought from the field and started thinking what to do. BRAC was very frugal and very innovative. The response was that let us focus on the children and give the job of adult literacy to somebody else to do. So Bangladesh has not abandoned the adult literacy. In fact, government of Bangladesh later on picked up a nationwide adult literacy program, which continued for quite some time. Now, what to do was a big issue in BRAC, and how to do. What would be the whole mandate of this children education. So it took almost a year that the whole program was designed. A few core principles that worked behind was it has to be sensitive to the marginalized population. Who are the marginalized population? Mostly girls who drop out from the school. Mostly the children coming from very poor families who, for a number of reasons, drop out of the school. In those days, our minister is sitting here in the middle of 80s, our enrollment rate was around 50 to 60%. Dropout rate was more than 40%. And it was not a common practice that the children would be completing primary education. So it was a very harsh and challenging environment. The other important guiding factor was the cost. How much costly it would be, and what would be the whole mission? How many children BRAC would be targeting to reach? So putting all these guiding principles together, BRAC decided to be very frugal. And the response was to have a one-room school. In those days, to have a one-room school was an absurd kind of concept in people's mind. Schools typically looks a huge building, number of teachers, with a large playground, and so on, and which are absolutely okay and ideal thing to have. But for a program which are targeting essentially to bring back the children into the classroom, who did not have a good experience in the classroom, subsequently dropped out, to bringing the children back to the classroom who never attended any school, although grown up, no more eligible for primary schooling. And that one room was consciously decided has to be very much outreached, close to the children's parents' home, so that children can comfortably come to school. They do not need an attendant with them to bring school and take them back. And particularly for the parents of the girls who are absolutely concerned of their safety. And there was also a frugality in selecting the teacher. Decided that let us have one woman right from the beginning, from the community. And the women, it's not a full-time job to her, it's a part-time job, so that she can do other household chores. So the combination of it was the program that we launched in 1985, just with 22 schools, which later grown significantly. It continued almost for 2.5 decades. Since middle of 90s, we at any point of time reached 1 million children. Until today, we had 10 million children who graduated from the BRAC school system. Now, what evolved over time, we started with the primary school, which caters to the children over a period of 4 years to complete the whole primary cycle, which is 5 years in Bangladesh. And inside the classroom, the whole pedagogy, there was a lot more innovation. And just to give one good example, we consciously said that every day in the class routine, there would be 20 minutes which would be dedicating to the co-curricular activities: singing, dancing, and drawing. And that was a core part of the curriculum. The whole philosophy was the children come to school to enjoy and not necessarily to the so-called formal learning. Formal learning associating to passing the exam in the formal exam. Later on, we recognized that Bangladesh journey needs additional support from BRAC. When government was doing pretty well on the primary sector, but challenges were on the quality front. And we looked into it very carefully and tried to understand how to really supplement the government efforts to improve the quality. One response was that a 1-year pre-primary schooling might be helping that children do better in the formal primary school. And the assumption fortunately worked. A study revealed that the children who completed 1-year pre-primary education in the BRAC Center would be completing their course in 5 years at a higher grade level, and the completion rate was more than 80%. Compared to the non-completers, it was far ahead. In between, there are other challenges came. Government teachers training program was not adequate to cover all the teachers in the system. BRAC decided to have an institute of education, which would be essentially focusing on capacity building of the teachers in the public system. And thanks to the Ministry of Primary and Mass Education, that we could work with them very closely in building the capacity of the teachers, in building capacity of Upadhyaya education officers. So that was a kind of bit of journey that we came through. Now, what are the challenges that Fatima was pointing out? And I would add two, three core points. We are in the 21st century now. It's a different time. The BRAC journey started in the 20th century. This 40 years in the human history, if we carefully look into, is an unparalleled progress that we experience. And according to some of the writers, never had happened at a rate in the past of the human history. And we can feel it in Bangladesh. Bangladesh was a country synonym to almost hopeless. And now we have hopes. This country is aspiring to become a middle-income country, and there are good reasons for it. This country, poverty alleviation that we have experienced, again, one of the very success story. While 60 to 70% of the population was under poverty, has been brought down to 20% despite some population growth rate in the last 2 decades. There has been significant success also in that area. Now, poverty alleviation itself, and I would like to underline, changed the people's philosophy, changed the people's aspirations. People want prosperity. People want to have a better life. And first and foremost, people want to give a better chance to their children. And they realize it very well, that although education is no more an equalizing factor to bridge the gap between rich and poor, but it's still one of the instruments that can change the whole face of a child within one generation. So this is the context that we are setting. Now, where the BRAC challenge was? BRAC challenge was this one room, the one teacher. It's a supply side constraint. The minister was just asking me before coming to here that how a one teacher can take care of every subject and all subjects very well. And that was a big constraint, big challenge. So what we are now trying to do, a number of things. Bringing more than one teacher. So we started a pilot which we call a cluster school. There would be 5 schools in one nearby complex. So each teacher would be then dedicated to one subject, and they would be moving from one class to another. There was another supply side constraint. Our program was seriously dependent on the development aid, thanks to our development partners who have been with us for a long time. But if we, Ian's record, if we look into, the global aid to education is reducing, and very unlikely that we'll see magic in the coming years. So how do we then adjust our strategy to that? That was a big challenge to us and remains a big challenge to us. Of course, we would like to continue working with our development partners. And the challengers, there are pockets of poverty in Bangladesh. And the success that we have is not equally spread. So it's pretty much unequal. There are pockets where the enrollment rate is lower. Quality is a serious issue. Now, World Economic Forum just brought their report, and in the Human Development Index, Bangladesh came out 111th countries out of 184 countries. And we have not done much well. The one region we have not done much well was the poor quality of education. So bringing all these factors requires a big shift to our strategy. And this is what we are now really working on. So I would like to underline, our work with the children coming from poor family will continue. And that would be definitely on a philanthropic approach. But at the same time, if you look into the parental contribution to education in the public school, and the state contribution to education in the public school. At the primary level, the data says if state spends 1 taka, parents are spending 1.5 taka. At the secondary level, if state spends 1 taka, parents are spending 3 to 4 taka. So now the major opportunity and big question is, how do you build the synergy between the two costs? And as a strategy, we have not really looked into that. And there is a good opportunity to that. So if we take that parents and state together are spending 2 taka, and how do we maximize the return? How do you bring a better quality and integrating to the opportunity, including the ICT and all other? There are one more challenges. The 21st century equality of education cannot be a continuation of the efforts of quality education in the 20th century. Just think of, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Before we go to the audience, I think just one quick question to all the panelists, which is the segue to the last thing that Shafiq Bhai said, which is around 21st century skill set. And yeah, our Honorable Minister is leaving. Thank you so much for your time. So I think I'll start with Yen in terms of this. Bangladesh also, like other countries, is facing this jobless growth. Fatima mentioned skills inequality, skills uncertainty. So in this space, you know, as a funder, is DFID looking at incentivizing these kinds of potential skill sets in some of these education interventions that is happening? And the follow-up question to Fatima is also, I know Pearson has done some funds, affordable learning funds. It has some experience in some of the new innovative startups that are coming in. Are you seeing a trend in terms of kind of trying to address this skills gap in terms of increasingly the newer kinds of jobs that are coming in, how to kind of prepare the young people for those things?
Thanks. Well, I think Fatima is probably better placed than me with that fine critique of all the Pearson reports that you have at your disposal around that skills uncertainty and skills gap. I mean, certainly I think part of our analysis is very much that when you say a young, you know, if you ask an employer how employable is a young person, they will go to 2 levels. You know, very much it's their attitude to work, their readiness to learn. A lot of those very much, you know, characteristics or traits which are perhaps more than specific knowledge they currently have in their own brain. So, for example, do they have the grit, resilience, trustworthiness, you know, honesty, ability to work in teams? So those are really important skills, and those aren't very straightforward to actually train or depart, certainly from a traditional didactic model. But I think that what employers really do require are those, in particular, foundational literacy, numeracy skills, and those in almost any second chance education, as I know BRAC has extensive experience in, that you repeatedly have to go back to those. And even in the first, even in many developed nations, that's still a really major problem, that some of that fundamental core skills aren't there. I think you know, from DFID's perspective, I think we would very much focus on the equity, you know, from the equity angle, to say, you know, it's much better if you have invested in the early years, but if you don't have that opportunity, you still need to focus on the more disadvantaged members of community from whatever dimension. I think minorities, remoteness, disabled young people, and try to really have programs of, you know, almost affirmative or positive action to work with those. And clearly the Convention for the Rights of People with Disability now applies to all countries, and I'm afraid I don't know, but I presume Bangladesh has also signed up to that convention. So I think that those sort of rights-based approaches with targeted action is really important. And it was great to hear last night that the BRAC also have many programs in that space.
Thanks, Asif and Ian. So just 2 points from me. The first one is the Pearson Affordable Learning Fund, where over a period of about 5 years, Pearson's been investing. There's a fund that we have. We've been investing in frugal edtech startups. I sit on some of the boards, and some of the some fellow board members are in the audience here as well. Stacy, James, others. Just from my perspective, one of the things I've found is that there are obviously exceptions, as there always are, but largely a lot of these edtech startups struggle in terms of leadership skills, management, sales, marketing, finance. And I think bringing business closer to the entrepreneurs and trying to share knowledge and skills is really helpful, because I joined these more from a Pearson perspective, to support more with helping them with their product plans. And generally I find that they're really good at that, but it's about how to take to market, how to be practical about business models. That's really, really a lack in that sector. We will continue to do that work and hopefully expand. We currently in Asia, several Asian countries, several African countries, and Latin American countries. Just going to the 21st century skills and the skills gap, how to address and prepare young people for their future careers. I mentioned when I was speaking earlier systems thinking, and in the research that we did in terms of skills for 2030, systems thinking and interpersonal or soft skills came out tops in terms of what the needs will be going into the future. The other thought that I've had for the last 2 or 3 years, really, in relation to 21st century skills, is that it still remains more of a theoretical notion than how to practically apply it so that children and youth really get those skills. What do we really mean? What does it mean? And I've started, Pearson has a unit dedicated to employability, and they're doing some really interesting work, particularly in the US, but working more in the higher ed sector and post-school. But one of the thoughts I've been having, and I have a small team starting to do some work on it, is how do we map 21st century skills into a set of standards that can then be built into curriculum and learning content, and things like teacher training, both in terms of their formal pre-service training as well as their in-service training. So that's an area I think that really hasn't been explored enough, and certainly those who are exploring it need to partner with each other so we can accelerate and leapfrog. These are the things that should be leapfrog so that we have more immediate
So it's a kind of vertical building that we have to look for. And the pre-primary education that BRAC is doing, Plenary is doing, Save the Children is doing, and thanks the government started doing. Now, in terms of framework, there are good things in it. But in terms of application, and the biggest problem in the Bangladesh education system as a citizen I see is the application. There are good things, but unfortunately those are not applied in the classroom. So the whole set of pedagogy is a problematic area. Now, one thing at some point we would be definitely touching. Now technology is a blessing, no doubt, but technology is unlikely to be replacing the teacher in the next 20 years. So the role of teachers remains fundamental. There is a joke, we in the education sector knows that whether this 1 year extra that they come at the age of 5 is a punishment for them or a reward.
Thank you. Okay, I have one here and one here. We take 2 or 3 questions and then we'll go to the audience. Maimuna, introduce yourself first and then.
Sure. My name is Maimuna. I'm the CEO of Teach for Bangladesh. My question is for Ian. In your presentation, you referred to the World Bank's Global Development Report that just came out, which talks a lot about the need to have a systems approach to changing education. And you talked a little bit about aligning different parts of government, and the report talks even more extensively about aligning state and non-state actors, about involving the community, the judiciary, the civil service, the private sector, et cetera. And so I'm curious from your perspective, what is the role that bilaterals and multilaterals can play in helping create systems alignments within countries towards a common education agenda?
Thank you. Great question. One on the back.
Hi, my name is Lamia Jabbar. I work at the Bangladesh Youth Leadership Center. We work with leadership. We have physical trainings, in-class trainings. We also have an online academy. I would like to place a question to the panel in what are your thoughts and opinions of having a blended learning model? You know there is such a gap in the skills. The curriculum that have been used all across the 20th century are now not as effective. So what are your thoughts on using blended learning to enhance the learning of students?
Thank you. There was some, Urvashi.
Hello, I'm Urvashi Sani. I'm a non-resident fellow at Brookings and the founder CEO at Study Hall Education Foundation in India, where I live and work. My question, first of all, congratulations for the panel. It was really very interesting and very informative. But my question is for you, Dr. Safiqul Islam. I totally agree that quality education in the 21st century can't look like what it looked in the 20th century. And I just was wondering if you would elaborate a little on that, because while we keep talking about 21st century skills, we talk about them in reference to the kinds of jobs that will be created. But I don't hear enough conversation about the kind of thinking and the kind of conceptual frameworks we need in children to cope with the changing social and political climate. Citizenship education was mentioned as one of the key desirables by the Secretary in his Education First initiative. So just to have your thoughts on what you think this might look like. Do we need peace studies? Do we need gender studies? Do we need, in Indian context, caste studies or communalism to think about all those things? That don't our children need to think about those as much as they need to think about the kinds of jobs they will need?
Thank you. So I'll get the first question to Ian around aligning state and non-state actors in improving system. Next question is for Fatima around blended learning. Third question is for Shafiq Bhai.
Okay, thank you. It was really great that you referenced the 2018 report. I mean, the World Bank do an annual report, World Development Report, and really it shows that education is really right at the top of the list. This is the first time there's been a focus on education in the report, realizing the promise of education. And certainly DFID, the World Bank, and many of the donors really agree with this approach to systems thinking. How do you align state, non-state actors, and if all of those sort of parts of the education machinery aren't working in unison, you won't get effective learning and quality outcomes. You asked specifically about the role of bilateral and multilaterals. So I think first the report in itself highlights donors' role in knowledge creation and sharing. There's been an awful lot of diagnostic work underpinning that report and many others like it. And I think that a key role is really sort of trying to play the honest broker that can really intervene between public providers, the government officials, to really sort of go into the political economy factors. I mean, I think a good example of this is perhaps the DFID's program entitled Deepen in Nigeria that works in Lagos State. Lagos is a huge mega city where I think 2/3 of the population attend low-cost private schools for primary education. And there really, there's been a growing awareness of the state through that program about the role that the non-state actors take. The non-state sector there is not formed of a gigantic mass school organization, social enterprise like BRAC. It's very much individual owners operating individual schools. And often there is that sort of tension to say, oh, those guys running those private schools, they're profiteering. Their only interest is to make money, is to avoid regulation, to avoid taxation. So I think really the sort of donor's role is to try to sort of offer financial incentives that can leave a better change, to spread knowledge, and also use our sort of political clout and relationships, some of the soft power that certainly the that the institutions that I represent come from to try to drive productive change.
Fatima, blended learning, the roles
Yes.
it can play.
So this is what I'm paid to do in my day job daily. I think about it every day, blended learning and learning assessment. The way I think about technology and education is on a continuum, and I think it's a useful frame for trying to find people where they're at and then moving them along the developmental line. So when I think about it, I'm thinking about what this means in a rural school in Zambia. What does blended learning mean there? What does blended learning mean in a school in Australia? Australia is the most advanced country in terms of using technology for learning. And so in places like Zambia, it could be as simple as supporting teachers through some mobile apps, offering offline access to content, and that's, I would consider that baseline and very basic at this point because technology is everywhere. Whereas in a place like Australia, you're looking at flipped classroom, you're looking at 100% access, strong infrastructure, high-powered Wi-Fi, etc. So I think that's a useful frame. But just kind of going back to the question more specifically, we have some experts in the room, particularly my friend Stacey. I think I'm looking at her. My eyesight is not great for long distance. And I think when you think about blended learning, it's really important to think about what's the purpose of blended learning. And we have to start with how will it improve education outcomes? And how will it improve quality? How will it make it easier for the teacher to collect performance data on students' performance so that they can start the journey towards personalized learning, which, as we saw, it's where we all want to go in 20 or 30 years' time. I've just found in all my travels and research and working with my teams that a lot of countries or a lot of businesses, everyone tends to focus on shiny things. So I started some work with the team in India, in Pearson, that had some really great ideas about how to develop a learning ecosystem so it's very accountable and it takes into account what the teacher needs to prepare for blended learning, what the content should be, what it means for parents, what it means for students. And what they're now doing is they tend to want to innovate, and they're innovating frugally every second month. Next, they want to use QR codes, then some other shiny thing emerges somewhere in Brazil, they want to bring that in. So I think thinking really carefully about what has the greatest impact and embedding that so that you have sustainability and you can go to scale would be something I think we really need to think about when we think about blended learning. The Spark School model, which I think Stacey is on a panel at some point, and those interested in blended learning should definitely visit, really has very thoughtfully embedded it into how the learning model works from a holistic perspective. I don't want to steal her thunder. And they've thought about what it means for the curriculum. What aspects of learning are best served by students using a computer, any kind of mobile device, and what aspects of learning are best served by teachers engaging face-to-face, human to human in the classroom. And I think that's the core of it. It almost sounds basic, but it's fundamental. And the more successful models have taken this kind of approach. The less successful models have been, we need blended learning, let's drop something into this classroom in this country as soon as we can. And then we know what the evaluations say about that. But I'm here until tomorrow evening, very happy to have hours of discussion on this with all of you.
Thank you. Shofik Bhai, 21st century skills, and can it be more than just employability?
Yeah. Now let me start with the 21st century quality. The reason I say has to be different because all that we heard since morning, that there is a strong unpredictability to the contemporary world. And this unpredictability within the country, across within the neighborhood, and all the diversity which we can think of. So my way of looking into the answer, now I beg pardon for my ignorance. I see and my experience is, education is one domain where it is less research. If you look into 50 top studies that was done by the global community in the last 6 months, I doubt there would be one even on education. 30 would be economics, 10 would be on the investment, 5 might be on the biology, and so on. So the amount of research that has been attached to education is insignificant. Look into our national budgets. We do not have an item called research within the ministry's budgets. There are exceptions. A country like China, which has within the education budgets, it allocates 8% for research. So we have to do a lot more research so that we understand what is the 21st century quality would be. And it would be changing very fast. So, and that's the problem. Because what we talk for 10, 15 years now, 2030, we may go through 2-3 strong phases, even in terms of quality and skill that would be that a child would be requiring. A huge challenge on the content developer, a huge challenge on the curriculum, a huge challenge on the assessment. So that's the kind of problem. But my personal way of looking into, a teacher has to be a researcher. The whole classroom has to be a research-led classroom. So teachers' training has to include elements of analysis, includes elements of patterns, so that teachers can assess the entire segment of the children in the classroom and devise the appropriate pedagogical issue to decide that which child would be requiring which type of quality matrix. And it's more of a matrix than just 1-2 segment. The 21st century quality will have no space for pretend. It has to be actual. Whatever we see, it's not enough that likely to be. And I see the kind of, the skill and capacity of a child to handle the complexity. Because it's much more complex world that we are looking. Just now think of when I was a child in secondary school, the math I had, now those are taught in the primary schools. So this is the level of shift which is happening. Now how a child would be handling all those? Similarly, the assumptions would be quickly changing. I feel bad for Bernie sometime, that 21st century skill, the book he has written, we all embraced it. Might be changing in 5 years and he has to come up with a new book. So the 21st century skill and quality of education essentially would be to cope with the changes and frequent changes. Thank you.
Thank you. I think with that, we're run out of time. I want to, let's give a round of applause to our wonderful insights from the panelists that we have seen. And all of them will be here for the rest of the conference. So if you have a question, you can always find them around and then have a one-on-one discussion. We'll welcome that. Tanzilut, take it away from here. Thank you.
Thank you to all the panelists for giving futuristic direction to ensure quality education globally, touching on the crucial points of financing, inclusion, technology, innovation, partnership, and system thinking. And also for bringing up the global challenges of skill inequality and uncertainty. And finally, talking about BRAC's frugal ways to reach students with quality education. This discussion has surely set the context for the rest of the discussion of this conference. And thanks to the audience for asking thought-provoking questions, which has made this conversation more lively. Before going for the first networking and coffee break, I'd like to announce the title of our next sessions, parallel sessions, starting at 11:30. The one that is rethinking assessment approaches to measuring student progress will take place in this room, in the auditorium. And the parallel session of that, the takeover, rewiring the education system, will take place in the banquet hall. Thank you and enjoy the break.